So, what was it like growing up on Route 66 during the space race when the nation was focused on math, science, and aviation?
Right, and that is an excellent question because that's how it all began, right? Started back in the 60s. Picture this. You live out in these high plains of Texas. Around you are wheat fields at the time. And anytime someone would look up, they could see thousands of stars because the city lights at that point, especially if you lived on the outer edges of the city, which I did, were didn't overwhelm the picture that you had. So the view on high plains of Texas at 3,000 feet at the higher altitude, but especially in the drier air, were just magnificent. And then you had this whole new era starting. And for a young boy such as myself, there couldn't have been anything better than to have the merger of cowboys from Texas and spacemen from NASA coming together at the same time. And when I watched those first astronauts get in their silver spacesuits and climb on that rocket and say, this is, and they'd launch into space, I knew that was something that I wanted to do. And to me, it befits the kind of pioneering people that settled our area of Amarillo back then, right? People that were tough and rugged. So it was just a special way to start my younger childhood and then to grow up through it. And now we're experiencing it again, right? You just had the launch last week and tomorrow you'll have the recovery of Artemis. So how exciting for our nation to have this happen again.
That transitions to my next question.
All
So,
right.
this past week, I've been keeping up with the Artemis 2 mission. How do you feel it's changed since you were a kid watching the early missions of our space program?
Yes, I can answer that question. Really, not much has changed, but then a whole lot has changed. So let's start with what's not changed a lot. That that is the basic math and physics behind spaceflight. It's a simple, I guess, problem that anyone who has ever wanted to build a rocket or fly into space has had to confront and overcome because somehow you have to get something that has weight traveling so fast that it goes into orbit around the Earth, and therefore you need rockets. And then if you want to go to the moon, now you have to have enough thrust and power from liquid propellant so that you can escape Earth's velocity. That hasn't changed in 50 to 60 years. So the basic concept of how we do this with rockets and solid rocket propellants and liquid propelled engines is still the same. However, let's now take it to where everything has changed. Well, the first thing that has changed is how technology is so much more advanced and it's integrated into the rocket and also integrated into the tools and the spacesuits that the astronauts use. And it's so much more advanced where previously you used analog dials and instruments to know what was happening on the rocket as you lifted up. You could watch the pressures and so forth, and you would actually move a knob to change something. Well, nowadays it's all computer controlled with touch screens, and the computers behind all of the computer processors are calculating what the rocket is doing, if it's going on the right trajectory, and the the health of the rocket. In other words, are all of the engines performing as they should? And so now the human is less in touch with the rocket itself, but that still gives him time to be in touch with the experience of space flight. So that hasn't changed either. So on one hand, not a lot, but on the other hand, a tremendous amount, just in 50 to 60 years.
So I watched an interview you did with Indu- Industries.
Yes.
You talked about your father and how he was one of the first air traffic controllers. Do you know much about that or what he did in
Oh, I
establishing
sure
him?
do. Yes. So when I think back on it, my father was right at the forefront of the growth of civil aviation, and civil aviation means commercial aviation, airliners to carry people from one side of the nation to the other. And he became involved in this because at the start of World War II, he wanted to become a pilot. He already was flying, so he had experience flying, and he wanted to fly for our Army Air Corps. And unfortunately, he wasn't selected for medical reasons. His eyes weren't good enough. But he decided to stay on, and during World War II, he trained to be an air traffic controller. There were not many air traffic controllers during World War II, but the military at all of their airports, they had to develop that skill set. And so then after World War II, he transitioned into that. So he was the gentleman that sat in the tower, and he controlled the aircraft as they came into the vicinity of the airport, first of all, to make sure that it was safe and to deconflict with other airplanes. And then once the airplane had touched down, in order to taxi to the right position. And then I guess you could say, in essence, he was the doorman in a way, like you would find in a hotel. As the airplane came in, here's how you come and land at our airport. I want you to land in this direction because the winds are in the right path here. And when you land, I want you to taxi over there. So he helped develop that entire skill set. And when I was young, he would bring me the to the air traffic control tower. And I had so much fun because down at the base of it were these radar screens, very antiquated radar screens compared to now. But I could see the radar scope turning round and blips would show up, and that would be the airplane that's coming in, and he'd point to it and say, okay, see that one? That one's coming from the west and that one's coming from the north. And then afterwards we'd go up, I think it was probably about 8 floors, and we would go to the tower and we'd sit there, and he had binoculars and he would show me, here are the planes coming in to land. And Amarillo had a really long airport runway at that time. So he really started me in this direction of aviation. So yes, I remember distinctly.
So you went to Tascosa High School. Was there anyone there who helped or encouraged you to get where you are now, or did everyone think it was impossible?
It was Mr. Reynolds. Yeah, Mr. Reynolds was my science teacher. And I learned a lot from Mr. Reynolds. I learned how to be objective when we did science experiments. And I think from him, I learned how to look at a problem and start to deconstruct it. And that sounds like a big word, but basically, how do I start to put together a test so that I can understand what it means and so forth. And, and later in life and still now, that's exactly what I'm doing. I look at a problem because our company still designs technology for drones. And so when we have a problem, we have to understand it from an engineering perspective. But that all started with Mr. Reynolds. But I want to tell you something. At that point, I did not know that I was wanting to be an astronaut. I was just a high school student and enjoying living in Amarillo and playing sports and having friends. I had good friends at Caprock High School as well. And eventually, later on, when I was in college, was when I decided to become an astronaut. But that being said, Mr. Reynolds was the one who taught me that. I do remember my math instructors too. Mr. Clark taught me math, and I remember my English instructors. They really pulled out of me how to think broadly. And so Tascosa played a big part in my development as I was growing up in Amarillo.
So you were part of the largest astronaut class, class 16, but the class before yours, class 15, was the class of Rick's husband. Did you ever get the chance to meet him?
Yes, I did. And I appreciate you asking that question because it's really a it's really a an understanding that in life you never know how your experiences and your lives are going to intersect with others you know. So yes, I knew Rick Husband when I was in junior high. I knew him in high school. And after he got married, I realized I knew his wife since elementary school. Isn't that interesting? His wife had grown up in Amarillo and lived just a few blocks from me, and we went to the same elementary school. Evelyn was her name. Of course, her name then, when she was married, was Evelyn Husband. And so, in a way, I had built-in friends. And did you know that it was in his living room that he and I, both of us being at Texas Tech University at the time, he and I sat down and said, we're going to go into the Air Force and we're both going to try and become astronauts. So not only did I know him, I really think of Rick as my soulmate per se, for having grown up in Amarillo, moved out, joined the Air Force, and having become an astronaut. And hopefully both of us have represented the great people of the Texas Panhandle well.
And you've been all over the place, not only just to space, but you studied in London, you've been to Europe. How do you feel you brought the Texas hospitality or your Route 66 roots to wherever you've been?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I'm really impressed with the questions you're asking me, Braden. So I think I brought the Texas swagger, and that Texas swagger, unbeknowingly, was given to me by living in Amarillo underneath those beautiful blue skies, the giant thunderstorms, the very gracious and good people of Amarillo. And then the work that I did around Amarillo as I was growing up. I had the wonderful opportunity in high school to work around and work in some of the cattle feedlots that we had. I also worked at the Texas A&M Agricultural Research Center. I worked on one of my friend's ranches before I went into the Air Force. And so all of that kind of melded and came together. And on the sides of it all the time were those things that everyone else around the world thinks of when they think of places like Amarillo, Texas. So they all think Western and cowboys and stuff. And here we were living in it, going to Cal Farley's Boys Ranch rodeos, in essence. And then, of course, Caprock is named after the Longhorns, and you had the Paladero Dons and things of this nature. So that whole cowboy charisma and the swagger and the graciousness to meet the world and shake someone's hand, that all started there in Amarillo. And it carried on throughout all of my trips in the military and the other places I've been. And I think it was a wonderful upbringing and character that the people in the high plains with Highway 66 running right through it gave me and helped me uh, make new friends around the world.
So I was gonna ask you a question about our airport, but then I found out that it was a myth that our site was selected as a temporary landing site for the space shuttle.
Well, that's really, in essence, that's somewhat true, uh, because the orbital path of the space shuttle most of the time would not have permitted it to have landed. However, all of the astronauts knew that the runway in Amarillo was long enough to support the shuttle coming into land. 3 miles long. That's as long as the shuttle landing facilities runway in Florida. And when we were at NASA, we had training aircraft, and we often flew from Houston, Texas to Amarillo to get some of our training in. And you know why we would do that? Why why Amarillo was chosen a lot? They had a really nice little airport cafe there, and they served some really good pie. So a lot of the folks sometimes would say, "Hey, I need to get some training in. Let's go do the training. Let's land in Amarillo, have some lunch and a good piece of pie, and then fly back." So we didn't have it as an official landing site, but all of the pilots knew where it was.
And that diner you were talking about, were you talking about Shelby's at Tradewinds?
No, it wasn't at Tradewinds. It was at, and I do know Tradewinds Airport, of course. That's a very famous airport. But it is the one that's next to the fixed base operations out there in Amarillo. It's been a long time since I've been there, but they had a nice little lunch and some nice pie that everybody enjoyed, especially Rick Husband. Rick and I would occasionally meet out there and have a piece of pie. And sometimes when I flew in, training wise, when my parents were still alive, and by that I mean my mother, she would meet me out there to have lunch before I went on to my other training assignments.
So, what was it like training? Because you've flown all kinds of aircraft, but what's one that's really stuck out to you?
Oh, you want to know what type of airplanes that I've flown? So you're right. I have flown many different kinds of airplanes. One of my favorite was the Goodyear blimp. What do you think about that? So when I was in test pilot school, I had the opportunity to fly the blimp, and I found that a really interesting uh, opportunity to experience something totally new. It moves very slow, as you can imagine. It's handled, and you maneuver the platform through a series of wheels and pulleys and things of this nature to change the ballast. And it doesn't climb very fast, but it sure was an interesting opportunity to fly something totally different from the high performance fighter aircraft that I did. And so it really expanded my knowledge. But I was very, very lucky to have had the opportunity to go to test pilot school and fly so many different kinds of aircraft.
I have one more question.
Just one?
So, when you were on that launch pad, what
Yes.
was going through your head? Like, any thoughts about your hometown of Amarillo or family?
Well, yes, not generally in that order. So let me describe the launch process, which really hasn't changed even for the astronauts from Artemis. So they did the same thing that I did, which is about 5 hours before launch, they go to the suit room and they get suited up. And then there's all these checks that occur to make sure the suits are properly operating. Then there's the walk out to the van, the white van that takes the astronauts out to the launch pad. And that's the first time you see all of the Kennedy Space Center employees there, and they're all clapping. And they're not clapping for you per se as the astronaut, but they're clapping for themselves and for our nation's space program, because here it is, the culmination of all this hard work. But you get into the van, and as you're driving your van out to the launch, unlike training days when there's activity everywhere, cars going left and right, as you drive to the launch pad, it's empty. And so you start to realize for the first time, oh, this isn't a dry rehearsal. This is the real thing. So you get out to the launch pad. There's a few technicians that are there to help you, but it's really just your crew, and it's pretty quiet out there. So you then go through the process of going up the elevator to the crosswalk that gets you over to the hatch to get inside your rocket. And that in and of itself, I don't know what it's like for Ryan, but I can guess. As for the space shuttle, the rocket is vertical, and so your seats are going to be basically inverted. So you're lying backwards in your seats, and how you crawl in is kind of an interesting prospect. But everybody gets in their seats, get all strapped in, and then the technicians leave, and then you're the only ones out there. And then you have a, they have probably 2.5 hours before launch then, where you have to go through all the checks. And that's when you have lots of time to think about things, because as you go through your checks, you finish those, and the next check, it doesn't occur for 15 minutes. And so there's some banter back and forth with the crew. How are you feeling? Are you nervous? Are you interested? And that's when I would have time to think about, my family and my career and how I got to this point. And you're right, I would think back about having grown up. And I think, and that is about having grown up in Amarillo, because, so many people ask me, how did I want to become an astronaut? And Amarillo gave me the foundation for that. But the important thing I would say is that at the right time, when I was at Texas Tech University, so really not far away from Highway 66 and Amarillo, I made this commitment to myself that I didn't want to be an astronaut. I said, I will be an astronaut. And I knew I needed to make the right decisions, such as joining the Air Force, that gave me the best chance to do that. And so I felt very blessed that I have grown up around and with a good family, such as yours, in a great place, such as where you are in Amarillo, having gone to a good school like you are, Caprock High School, and then wherever you may go, I think you'll find, as I did, that the foundation that you and I have growing up in that high plains of Texas with the views and with the, that good, crisp, clean air to breathe, even when the wind's blowing, it gives you that feeling that you can do anything. And so I knew at the time when I was on the rocket, I was ready to fly. And it all started in Amarillo. And, in essence, the spirit of Highway 66 runs through your blood when you're ready to go explore in a rocket.
All right. Thank you.
Yes. I'm going to add to your question. You ready for this? Someday I want to ride down Highway 66 in an open convertible, because, that's what everybody thinks of Highway 66, right? You're going down that road and you have that convertible you're driving in, the top's open and things like this. And you're listening to your music and you're looking at the vistas as you're driving west, passing through Amarillo and then continuing on. And in a way, my space shuttle ride was almost the same thing. The windows weren't open. That would have worked. But in a way, my orbital path around the Earth was a little bit like Highway 66, right? Heading out towards adventures from places known to places unknown. And I'm very happy that the places known for me started in Amarillo. And I'm very pleased to have met you, Brady.
Great to meet you too.